So if you haven't already, please turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 16. This is going to be lesson 16 in our booklet. We have about another month left in this study, so we'll be finishing up the book of Exodus. This coming Wednesday, instead of having this class, because we've been tag teaming, I take Sundays and Harry takes Wednesdays. This Wednesday will be our singing, so we will be skipping that lesson, and I will pick up with number 17 next Sunday. So this is, I only post this up here because, as you may be aware or would like to know, all of these presentations and the material in them, the maps and the outlines and everything, is all posted on our website for class material if you need to go back and refer to them later. These are the sections of the scriptures that we've already covered in this study. The 10 plagues is a rather interesting one as far as a storyline goes. It's something that God has used to show his magnificent power and his ability to pretty much go down the list of all the Egyptian gods and trump every one of them, including the firstborn of the family. So we're going to continue this morning. Right now, where we are in our saga, the children of Israel have left Egyptian captivity, and while pursued by Pharaoh and his army, they have, through God's power, been victorious. They've crossed the Red Sea, and they are now right about here, on their way through the wilderness of Shur, the wilderness of Sin, and it's not marked here, but the wilderness of Sinai, which will lead them to the base of the mountain for our study this morning. The chapter 16 is a very brief outline. We go over this. Please read your material, read your text, and read through the booklet, answering some of the questions if you would. The intent is not for you to memorize it, but the intent is for you, especially since there are 4 sections in the little booklet for you to fill out, is to go back through and note God's word and understand the questions, understanding the answers. And as you do so, as I mentioned last time, kind of look at some of the symbology, some of the things that are written down for our learning, even though we're not under the law of Moses, and we're going to talk about that this morning when we're in the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, per se, are not binding on us today, but you will see a lot of symbology, and you will see a lot of the structure of God's expectations for man as his creation and for God as our creator. Develop the proper relationship between those so that we know how to treat him, we know how to treat each other, and we know how to act to get ourselves under control so that we can please him, because that is why we're here. So Israel leaves Elim. What was in Elim? Why did they camp there? Anybody remember from last week? Water, food, palm trees. How many Israelites are we talking about here? We're not sure exactly, but it's somewhere probably in excess of 1 million to 1.5 million, maybe more. We're told it's 600,000 men, not including women, children. I don't think they had too many servants because they were servants, but not to mention their cattle, flocks, and possessions.
Hey, and livestock.
Yes.
I mean, each you know, we have families that don't have any, and they all had some.
Right.
And imagine how many millions of, and how much, just the devastation on the land that they went through when the city of Oklahoma City, with their livestock, went through a place.
Right.
You know, it's just crazy to
Yes.
imagine. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Don't. Yeah, next time somebody whines to you about shipping logistics and supply chain issues. Of course, we don't have God's, miraculous intervention when we're trying to get our possessions out of China. But just keep that in your mind, what a huge undertaking this was when the nation of Israel moves from one place to the next. They've left Elam. The people, I mentioned this last time, get used to it. The people grumble, or in the King James Version, they murmur, grumble. I found out this week, or this lesson more than others, if you don't have King James, you may not be able to get all the blanks filled in exactly right, because some of the words are different in King James than they are in some of the newer translations. People grumble about food. They talk about how great it was when they were in Egypt. 430 years of bondage as slaves and what was called a hard life. And yet, now they're reminiscing about how great the food was. God provides quail in the evening and manna in the morning. So God gives details about the gathering of the manna. What were those details? Anybody want to fill us in on that? Okay. You were to gather when? In the morning. Don't wait till noon. What happens at noon? Melts. Gather in the morning. How much? An omer. Okay. Well, I'm not prepared to give a weights and measures study, but let's say that it was something that would fit in a pot, because later on Moses was told by God to save a pot of manna. Okay, we'll get to that. All right, and on the Sabbath day, what were they supposed to do? So they could eat, but they were not to work. It was a day of rest. And that work included, I believe, cooking and preparing. So was there manna available on the Sabbath?
Only if they picked it up.
Only from the day before. So double portion was made available to them in the morning before the Sabbath. And there are details about that. What did you notice about the scriptures that talk about God's expectations for the people and his reaction to what they did?
He's there to follow it to the T. I think it's just amazing when you read this and they're to gather their portion in the morning, to us, Sunday through Friday, the first 6 days of the week. And if they gathered more, it stank and had worms. But yet, when they gathered that the day before the Sabbath, it did not change. And just realizing that God's power and that simple command, that God's in control of that manna.
Did he warn them what would happen to it? We have recorded for us what happened, but typically he just says, this is what you're supposed to do. Doesn't have to always give you the reason why you're supposed to do it that way, or what's going to happen if you do it wrong, because he does express disappointment that there were people that didn't follow instructions. That's the nature of God. He is the creator, and he is so far above us that we are to obey. Most of the time, we can see the logic in it. He'll explain the logic in it. He'll tell us why. He'll tell us sometimes what does happen when we do something wrong, but sometimes he does not. He expects us to just obey. We're going to talk a little bit later about the testimony. I found this to be a little bit eye-opening for me. We'll get to that at the end of the outline. So I blew this up a little bit. It doesn't look real good, but I wanted you to be able to see wrong button, specifically where we are here, because we're moving into this area. Now we're moving away from the promised land, but we're moving towards the place where God is going to be on the top of Mount Sinai. Chapter 17, Israel goes to Rephidim. I don't know how to pronounce that. But here we are again. Nation of Israel grumbles. It's not that they didn't need the water. They needed the water. It's the way that they approached it. It's the attitude that they had before God. And Moses has to remind them that while they come and they, in this particular instance, the scriptures refer to it not just grumbling, but they actually quarreled with Moses. And that seems to be important because he attaches that to the name that he gives this location. But it's not like they come to him and say, Moses, please intercede for us and ask God how we can get water to feed our families and our flocks. They grumble. Why have you brought us out here for us to die in the wilderness? What are we going to do? And Moses said, these people are ready to stone me. So it has a lot to do with how you ask. Jason?
The absence of faith on their part, that even though they've been without water for 3 days, which is a long time to go without water, they probably had some kind of reserves in some way, but they
Right.
were out, running out, and they didn't have that faith that God, even in those difficult situations, would provide.
And even there may be some of those that had the faith, but didn't ask properly. They might have been able, some of them may have believed that God could do anything, and he certainly demonstrated that he can. But they didn't phrase the question correctly. And God's a little bit upset with that, but he says what? What does he tell Moses to do? Okay. What does he strike the rock with? Okay. Staff. And where is God at this time? This was new to me. I hadn't read this before, hadn't remembered it. He's standing on the rock. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. That's a lot of water. But God can do anything. So Amalek, I wasn't really sure exactly if that was a person or an army or a country, but I think it actually may be all. They come to fight against Israel, and Joshua is chosen to lead men into battle. And we talked about this a little bit in on our previous lessons, that while Israel left Egypt dressed for battle, it wasn't like they had an army that was capable of taking on the Egyptians without God's help, because they'd been in slavery for a really long time. Doubt seriously if there was a well-fit and well-trained army allowed to be brought up underneath the Egyptians while they were in slavery. Nevertheless, they went to fight Amalek. So, want to give me a description on what happened next? So, I have no idea what the significance of this is. But it's very interesting, and it shows God's power with the interaction of man. Moses, when he held up his hands, Joshua's troops were successful. And when he got tired and he lowered his hands, they started to lose ground. So what did they do for Moses? What did they bring to him? All right, they got a place for him to sit. And when his hands got tired, they held him up. And so, they won the victory with God's help.
You know, I'm puzzled at your comment, Jeff. You don't understand the signification of this battle. We see these great things God has done for the people of Israel. And here He's showing them that even though this land is full of these people, which we've read that previously in this asked them, in fact, came from Ishmael, I believe, right? We discussed. And so we know they're there. We know they're enemies. And that what Joshua was going to go lead an army of faith. And he shows that God is showing them, I will lead you, I will protect you, I will take care of you. Again. So I see great significance in this. And also, you know, knowing fast forwarding when they send the spies in, that they're going to forget this battle, but God shows them over and over, I will protect you. So I think it's, to me, very incredible. So we don't really know that they've been a trained army. But understand it's God's winning.
Right. Well, I guess maybe I should rephrase my comment. I'm not sure what the significance of holding or lowering hands is, specific to any kind of symbolism that I had read or could think about before. But there's no doubt about it, if it was not for the power of God, that wouldn't have had anything to do with anything. Because it wasn't a signal or anything like that. It was strictly an issue where God allowed His power to be shown through the Israelites. DJ, do you have a comment?
I was just saying, I think that's kind of the point as well, is it doesn't make sense other than God's power, you know? And I think that's kind of the part of it, because it's God's power, it's not the fact that Moses is technically
Right.
holding them up. I think that is the point. I don't think there's much more to it.
Right. Thank you.
And David hinted at a great point. These people have been in slavery for 400 years. They were not soldiers.
Right.
You don't teach your slaves to attack and fight and win and battle and train them at the edge of the sword. So for them to go out against this other army in this battle, that they would have been fairly lost. I'm fairly certain. I'm going to make some assumptions there, but that wasn't their motive. You know, they were shepherds, and now they're in battle. And once again, it's purely the power of the Lord that allows them to overcome in this battle.
And they probably had some able men. I mean, they've been making bricks, and they were, you know.
I'm not saying they were wimps.
Right,
I'm
but they
saying
were not trained soldiers. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And they're from Esau, not Israel.
Pardon me?
They're Amalekite are from the descendants of Esau.
Okay. Esau's descendants. Okay. So Moses builds an altar and gives it a name. There doesn't seem to be any other significance other than that, but God has some specifics about what He wants done for altars that receive sacrifices, because this is part of His worship. And when God says, this is what I want you to do, that's what we do. Chapter 18, who's Jethro?
Priest of Midian and his father.
Okay. Priest of Midian and Moses' father-in-law. So he hears. Now, we mentioned last time that a great deal of what we've got going on here with what God chose to do in Egypt to show His power over false gods and to bring the children of Israel out of slavery was to make sure that everybody knew about His power. These things that went on These miracles were front page news. Well, wait a minute. I guess the Egyptians supposedly came up with papyrus for paper, but the printing press hadn't been invented yet. So front page news was word of mouth. Jethro in Midian, which is quite a distance away from Egypt, had already heard about what God had done for the children of Israel, and he meets Moses in the wilderness. Moses then sits to judge the people. Now, what was this about? What does it mean when it says Moses sits to judge the people? He's handling disputes. It's a lot of people. There's a lot of disputes. Your goat stepped on my kid's foot. Or, I wanted to get to the water first. Or just sit and think about how many possible disputes there are for Moses to deal with. Not only with his own wisdom, but also to ask God for righteous judgment on some of these decisions. Well, Jethro comes and suggests an alternative plan. That he get good men, who the scriptures say, men who hate a bribe, honest men, able men, and create a bit of a hierarchy when it comes to decisions and disputes and problems to judge between children of Israel. Moses says that's a great idea, puts that into place, and that works out better. Moses handles the big issues, and the able men handle the smaller issues. Makes sense. Then Jethro returns to Midian after that. Chapter 19. Now we're going to move all of the people to the base of the mountain, Mount Sinai. What happens at Mount Sinai? Moses receives the Ten Commandments. God calls the nation to obey him and to become a holy nation of priests. Had they not known this before? Maybe not. They had been given promises. It had been obvious that they were in favor with God somehow because he had displayed his power to get them released from captivity. But did they really quite understand yet what was going on with God's plan for the future of the nation of Israel? We're starting to see a little bit of a turning in the relationship, not from the way God had planned it, but from the way the people understood it. That they were to now be a selected people, a holy nation of priests before God. God's chosen people for a purpose. They may not have understood what that purpose was yet. But he's starting to give them instructions about what they are to be and what they are to do. And this turns out to be a preface for the Ten Commandments. He tells them to wash their clothes, tells Moses to consecrate them. Get ready. God is coming to a mountain near you. They're also warned not to touch the mountain. Now, this is one of those situations where they are told what happens if you touch the mountain. What happens if you touch the mountain? This is a serious situation if you value your life. So God comes to the top of Mount Sinai in a thick cloud. What else goes along with that thick cloud? Thunder, lightning, rumbling. Power of God is not minor, not small. So I think everybody in here has heard of the Ten Commandments. We've certainly heard about it when they're put on a plaque and put in a hall or a building that's owned by the government, and how there are people who hate God so much that they cannot stand the idea of the Ten Commandments being posted in a government facility. Are we under the Ten Commandments today? Why is that? It's part of the law of Moses. It may be the beginning, but as we see later on, the statutes and the limitations and the ceremonial law for the law of Moses is going to be given to the people word by word. This is what you do, right down to what happens if someone accidentally hurts someone, what happens if your ox is in a ditch. Some of it is ceremonial law when it has to do with the feasts and those things, but some of it is just civil law. How do you treat your neighbor? How do you treat your brother? How do you treat your neighbor's possessions? This is the start. 10 Commandments. I wrote them down. I think most of us can probably quote most of them, at least out of the King James. You know, the thous and the these, and it seems to be a little more poetic. You can commit that to memory a little easier than common modern day English. Is there anything here that surprises you? I didn't prepare this, but it does bring to mind a lesson I heard one time about this one right here. You will not make or worship any, King James says, graven image, carved image, manufactured image. Did you know that that's missing out of catechism? Food for thought.
It's missing out of what, Curt? I'm sorry.
Catechism.
Catechism?
Yeah, there are copies of the Catholic Bible and the Catechism study that this is not there. So I'm only bringing this up because I want you to think if you're not familiar with some of these symbolisms and some of these things, the reasons why the New Testament church does and does not do things. This is why you don't see plaques on the wall and a cross on the steeple. And we typically don't even do the steeple because it kind of looks funny without the cross on it. Images. You'll find a lot of Christians don't wear crosses. They don't hang them from the rear view mirrors. They don't put them in their houses. They don't put them on their church buildings. Because this seems to be an issue, not only for man, but for God. And I'm not saying that's what this is specifically, because we know the nation of Israel is famous for putting together what? Golden calves. What else? They make all kinds of items. We mentioned before the idea of cutting down a tree and carving a god out of one part of it and burning the other one.
Curt, this is the Old Testament. Is what you were saying, I kind of take a little back to it. Like you said, wearing crosses or having something in your house in that manner. This is the Old Testament. We're not under that.
Right.
Like if my wife had a cross necklace that she wore, which she's not, or I don't even know if she does, but I don't see how there would be anything wrong with that. Is there something wrong with that? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that we see God's reaction in the Old Testament to certain things. Actions, attitudes, items, laws, breaking of laws. And we know that the Old Testament is there for our teacher. For example, we're about to get into a section of the scripture that talks about nakedness, about going up the steps to an altar. Make sure that the priests are covered.
Right, it dealing with
So
the
that,
priests.
right, nakedness is not covered in the New Testament. It's covered in the Old Testament. It's our teacher for how God feels about certain things and sins, so we have to be careful to watch for that.
Sure, but with this specifically, if you read down two further that, it says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and
Right.
not under the Sabbath.
That's right. I'm
So
not
it's
saying this is
saying-
I'm not saying this is a binding law.
But you kind of were saying
Okay.
that how even now, we as Christians have issues with this. And I personally don't have an issue
Good.
with a woman wearing a cross on a necklace.
Mhm.
And I couldn't say that that is wrong.
Neither could I. What I'm saying is that the symbolisms that you see in the Old Testament oftentimes apply now because of God's attitude towards them. Let's take a few more hands.
You mentioned the catechism, so specifically Catholics and people that are of that persuasion put a lot of emphasis on sacraments that are not authorized. They worship those things, those saints, they worship, it's involved in their worship in a way that is improper. I think that's kind of what you were pointing to, that putting those emphasis, like the shroud of, I don't remember the.
Shroud of Turin, right?
Yeah.
And the statues.
Putting emphasis on these items that have no significance, and putting them in a place of worship.
Mhm.
Where the building, a building that you worship in is a
Right.
building. It's, that is not a sacred.
Right. The building is not holy.
structure, per se. That's what I took you to mean with that.
PJ?
Acts 17:29-30 says, therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Surely these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. And I think it's when they were both pointing out, when they turn it into something holy. When that cross, like, oh, you can't, I got my cross on, I can't sin. I've heard that before, that has nothing to do with worship. You worship those items when you hold, or like you brought up Catholics, when they hold up the Bible, like the actual book, like not the words in the book, but the literal book. Like if they drop the book, it's a disgrace.
Yeah,
you know
a
what I
sin
mean?
or something.
So it's when you hold those items above actual God's word. Like they do a lot of this stuff, but if you throw my cross on the ground, I'm going to lose it. Stuff like that. And because I think it's easier to, I don't know necessarily why, but those items they somewhat worship them because they hold them higher than actual God's word.
Exactly. James?
Mary's lesson this morning, some of these things were mentioned for the action of a Christian to either participate or not participate in. So a lot of the things, we know by 1 Timothy 3:16, other passages that all scripture is there for our learning. But in Malachi 3:6, God said, I am the Lord, I change not. So throughout the Old Testament, all of these things that has anything to do with morality whatsoever, we know that he's not changed. None of that has changed. The only thing that has changed ceremoniously, the things that Israel were required to do before God versus what we do as Christians in the church. And I believe that's kind of the point that we work out.
Appreciate the comments. Certainly hope you understand my intent. We want to watch for things in the Old Testament as we learn. But we know when we talk about the rest of these, except for the Sabbath day, most of those have been brought forward to us in some way, shape, or fashion by Christ. But the Ten Commandments is just a start. So keep in mind, Fast forward to the first century, when Jesus talks to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the priests and those in the temple, when he says that they are holding up the laws of man above the laws of God, and they're not even keeping what has been recorded for them. We're talking about the law of Moses, where this is the beginning. This is not the totality. This is only the beginning. So we're going to see a lot as we move forward if we go into Leviticus. But if you have an opportunity to read Leviticus, very interesting about how God expects his people to act within his chosen people, within his holy nation. Chapter 20, when God descends upon the mountain and gives Moses the Ten Commandments, the people saw the lightning and the smoke, and what was their reaction? They knew God was there. They were told that God was going to be there. They prepared for it. But they were frightened to the point of, Moses, you talk to God for us, and then you tell us what he said. Because if we go meet God, we're afraid we're going to die. They'd already been warned about touching the mountain or coming onto it. So God gives the instructions about the materials, the building materials used to make an altar for sacrifices. What did he say he did not want? Yeah, hewn stone. Okay, that would be those fashioned with tools because it corrupted the stone. That's what he wants. That's what we're going to give him. We ran out of time this morning for our questions. I meant to cover a lot of those. Let's jump to the extra. This has to do with something we didn't really cover this morning about the manna. This is, to me, not mentioned as a miracle, but is certainly interesting. That when the children of Israel were sent out to collect the manna, some collected a lot and some collected a little, and yet everybody wound up with the same amount. Okay. Who quotes that in the New Testament? And where is that? 2 Corinthians 8, verse 15. He that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. God provided for the nation of Israel miraculously in so many different ways that maybe they didn't even quite understood. We don't see that today in miraculous intervention by God, but I think there's a lot to learn from the study of how he directly interfaces with the people, the children of Israel, and the things that he does for them. So, we're out of time. Does anybody have any final comments before we wrap up?
You know, I'd like to just bring out the humbleness of Moses.
Right.
You know, here he is leading this million people and has done these things to the power of God, and he's been part of this, and yet his father-in-law says, I have counsel for you. And he listens.
Yeah, he doesn't say, well, who are you?
He does, exactly. I mean, how many of us, I mean, me included, as my wife does, I'm like, who are you? I'm king of my acre. You know, and I think it's just a great teaching point to us to be humble. And, you know, and it says he took heed to his advice.
Good point. In fact, I think I remember somewhere it's mentioned that God says that Moses was the most humble man that ever lived. Jason?
So our earlier discussion, taking something from God and turning it into something improper, 2 Kings 18:4, he removed from the high places days the children of Israel did burn incense to it and called it Nehushtan. They took something
Right.
with purpose from God and they perverted it
Right.
in a, improper
Right.
usage.
Started worshiping it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you very much.